Okay, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Brittany Higginbotham, and I'm a Communications Associate for the Institute for Public Relations. Thank you all for joining us today for this IPR webinar on the findings from the 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer and all of the latest trust research that Edelman produces each year. So today, Deidre Campbell, U.S.Chair of the Financial Services Sector from Edelman, and Edelman New York President Oscar Suris will present the latest trust research and answer all of your questions in our Q&A portion at the end of the call. But before we begin, I have a few reminders for you. First, we encourage you to ask questions in the Q&A box, and we will allot time at the end to answer a few audience questions. You are welcome to use the chat box at any time to leave comments and share resources. We will also be sharing resources in this chat, but please note that an IPR staff member will be moderating questions throughout the Q&A only. If you have any logistical questions or tech difficulties, just feel free to private message any of the IPR staff members in the Zoom chat. And then this webinar will be recorded and available for playback on our website and YouTube channel, and as well as the resources that are shared will be linked to our website. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers. First, we have Deidre Campbell. She is the chair of Edelman's Financial Services Sector in the U.S., comprising 650 team members in 33 offices around the world. Focused on building trust relationships with key stakeholders, the team partners with financial service companies around the world to evolve their communications and marketing. For the last 25 years, Deidre has designed results-oriented programs encompassing traditional and social media relations, executive communications, social impact, stakeholder mapping, content creation, and digital activations. Deidre advises the C-suite on issues such as reputation management, regulatory change, financial tech disruption, and the role customer experience plays in the industry. We also have Oscar Suris, president of Edelman New York, and the largest market operation at the global integrated communications company. Prior to joining Edelman, Oscar was executive managing director in crisis and C-suite strategies at Zener Group. His corporate communications experience includes 20 years of providing strategic counsel to Fortune 100 companies, including serving as executive vice president and head of corporate communications at Wells Fargo, and senior leadership roles at Ford Motor Company and AutoNation Incorporated. So now we'll get to the fun part. I'm gonna pass it off to Deidre as she presents the first portion of our presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Brittany. So it's really, I'm sure I speak for Oscar as well when I say it's really one of our greatest honors to be affiliated with the IPR, and also to get to leverage and share out this data that we get through the Edelman Trust Institute, which I'll talk a little bit about. The research that I'm going to share is going to relate to geopolitical business, and is the research that Richard Edelman launched at Davos just a few weeks ago in May. And since then, another report's come out. Just last week, a report came out on racial justice, and Oscar will be presenting that piece, and then we'll save time for questions. So please think up some tough questions. So with that, let's get started. So as I said, this was the deck that was released in Davos. Just for a little context, the Trust Barometer was really conceived in 1999. It was, some of you might recall the battle in Seattle. It was the gathering of the World Trade Association, World Trade Organization, the WTO, and they were behind closed doors negotiating trade policies. And NGOs really felt that that represented a massive lack of transparency and relieving the amount of the conversation, and followed by a breakdown in trust. So Richard Edelman was really kind of looking at that situation unfold and sort of created the Trust Barometer to better understand how societies and their primary institutions function. So essentially, the core of the Trust Barometer measures trust in government, business, NGO, and the media in specific countries. And the question would be, how much do you trust any one of those organizations to do the right thing? So somewhat subjective. And oftentimes the data is broken out by the top quartile income earners and the rest of the population. And we've got some of that data in here to show you. Even in 2016, the Edelman Trust Barometer really foretold the coming of the populist movement as we started to really see a divide in which institutions were trusted by whom and which were not. So as I mentioned, Richard, in 2020 released the Trust Barometer at Davos in January, as he always does. And 6 weeks later, it was completely irrelevant. The world had fallen into a pandemic. We all thought we were going home for 2 weeks. Richard launched the Edelman Trust Institute that now puts out multiple reports over the course of the year to really dig into sort of the issues that investors, that companies, that individuals are experiencing to understand trust building actions and what the expectation is from the population from those 4 institutions. So if you look here at this slide, you'll see just some of these reports that has been coming out since the pandemic. So obviously, starting with the pandemic in March of 2020, understanding the expectation of business and its response to the pandemic. With the murder of George Floyd, we went back into the field to understand what systemic racism really looks like, how it's being experienced, looking at it through the lens of different audiences. And again, understanding what the expectation is from employees and customers. And Oscar has an update on that report today. Super eye-opening. Employee activism, we saw employee activism really pick up in September of 2021, and we wanted to understand the employee expectations of social impact and as it related to their employer. We saw something like 6 years ago, that was sort of a millennial factor, but in the last 3-4 years, it's clearly been a global expectation. ESG, in this report in November of 21, there was a lot of dialogue with the breakout of the pandemic that ESG was kind of a nice to have and would have to go by the wayside while the world dealt with more challenging problems. And thankfully, the opposite happened, and people really leaned into the S, while still focusing very much on the E, which led to the next report, sort of in tandem very much about climate change and the race to net zero, and what the expectations were of consumers. And so the report that I'm sharing today is going to be on the geopolitical, next slide please, the geopolitical situation, as which really trying to get a snapshot of the expectation of companies that are engaged in geopolitical activity, including response to the war in Ukraine. This particular research is 14 countries, 1,000 respondents per country. And let's dig in. Next slide, please. So amid Ukraine crisis, trust rises in the West. So what does that mean? Next slide, please. You'll see here, these are the countries that are measured, the left column being a January measure and the right column being a May measure. And you see the biggest gains in trust coming in the UK, coming in the US, and coming in Germany. And as we look at that, and dig in a little deeper, we are looking at those countries' responses to the crisis in Ukraine during the period that the research was in the field. And so the slides that follow will dig into that a little bit more. Next slide, please. Here are the 4 pillars that I was talking about. Business here is the only trusted institution at the moment. This is a global number. You become trusted at 60. So you see business kind of crept into the trusted category. NGOs, government, and media still all neutral, with media up 2 points, but there's been a lot of wobbly trust scores in the media for the last few years, as the polarization is a concern, and disinformation has become a concern. Next slide, please. Here we are looking specifically at income levels. And so this top band up here are going to be the top 25 income, or top 25% income earners in these countries. And this is a global number. So you see that trust is in a pretty decent space at 66 for the higher quartile of income earners, you see that they are actually trusting across the board, all 4 institutions. And look at those, that bar in the middle with the numbers in circles, the big bold ones, that's the divide between the bottom quartile of income earners and the top quartile. So you see very double digits up into the 20s, very, very different views on should these institutions be trusted in their country. So that's sort of higher than we've ever seen. Next slide, please. Again, these numbers are from January to May. It's interesting to see here some movement between the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States. Back in January, business among Republicans was in the distrusted category. And that is the first time that we had ever seen the people identifying as Republican telling us they did not trust business. So that 8-point increase is substantial, but it still doesn't put it into the trusting category where it had always been prior to January of 2022. So the media, you can see the polarization of the media and how that's driving that 31% divide, 25% divide for government. So these are some big numbers. Next slide, please. So what is it? So the crisis in Ukraine, what are companies doing? What can they do? What is expected of them? And we'll look at that in the slides that follow. Next slide, please. So this, again, globally, nearly 1 in 2 are telling us that they will buy or boycott brands based on their response to the Ukraine. 47% are telling us that they have already started to alter that behavior towards a brand or a company. And you see down at the bottom bar, the breakdown by gender, by age, and by income. There's not a whole lot of variance. There's some, sure, but not big swinging numbers. I think the expectation very highly is that companies will, not support anyone that is supporting the activity in Ukraine. We found that employees employees are also very strongly expressing both loyalty and employer advocacy based on if their employer is doing a good job in meeting their expectation for how it should respond to the Ukraine conflict. And you'll see some pretty big gaps there in terms of what the companies they think are doing well versus the companies they think are not doing well in the gray bars. Next slide, please. Trust in companies is at stake based on the response to the Ukraine crisis. So actions that are creating more trust is ceasing to do business in Russia, protecting the safety of ex-employees, temporarily suspending business in Russia, and much less trust for those not taking action, specifically in areas like carrying on doing business in Russia, or making statements in support of Ukraine, making the statements, but then having no action to follow it. So, empty words are being closely watched as this conflict unfolds. Next slide, please. So what is the ask of business? And how is business meant to be responding to geopolitical scenarios? That is a new expectation of business that we've never seen before. And so let's unpack what that looks like just a little bit here. There are, we looked at it sort of categorically. We know and have known for a long time that there is an economic responsibility, the expectation that business will do things like create jobs, provide safe products, drive innovation, grow the economy, wealth creation. So like run your business and bring good things into the world at 85. So quite high and has been for a long time. As I mentioned before, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started to see the social responsibility become more of an ubiquitous expectation than with a certain generation or certain, geographic areas. It's very much a global expectation now. And that relates to things like training employees, supporting your local communities, providing trust, addressing climate change, pollution, poverty, water insecurity, wage inequality, and promoting cooperation across political differences. Like that's a pretty big expectation of business if you think about it, promoting cooperation across political differences. But then I think you take that finding at 77% and it sort of tips its hat toward this last column here to the right on geopolitical responsibilities. That part of that is understanding that employees' expectations for cultivating admiration for our country's values, for punishing countries that violate human rights and international law, and that up to almost 60% is sort of getting up there on the scale of all the responsibilities that business is now expected to lead on. Next slide, please. And what are they expect business, in fact, at 95%, so overwhelmingly expected that when a country engages in unprovoked invasion, that companies that have interests in that country will start to respond in one or more ways. In areas like speaking out against this behavior, applying, again, political or economic pressure, combating misinformation and providing trustworthy information, and terminating business activities. Almost no one believes they should do nothing. At that, the number there, tiny little number there was 5. Next slide, please. So they are expected to act beyond active conflicts. So what does that mean? That they expect business to take actions as it relates to not doing business with aggressive governments, thwarting abusive labor practices, promoting inadequate or not responding adequately to environmental protections. And so you see, again, applying political pressure coming back up again. And we're starting to see politics into the mix for the role in business, which is very interesting. Next slide, please. That some of the sort of game-changing positive impacts or the things that companies are doing around climate change, human rights, and the withdrawing from Russia and supporting the Ukraine. Next slide, please. That said, business is expected to draw a line in the sand. So these global numbers are telling us that in the majority of the markets that we surveyed, 13 out of 14, that there is a overwhelming belief at 62% that business has a moral responsibility to set limits on what is acceptable and then pull out of countries that operate beyond them. That there's also 10 of the 14 markets believe that businesses that fail to condemn and punish a country's behavior express implicit approval of that behavior. So the majority saying that inaction in and of itself is an action, and that it's not an acceptable one. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the CEO? I mean, we've been talking about purpose and taking a stand and counseling clients on how to do this for a long time, but it looks like we're entering very much a new territory as we start to talk about geopolitics. So next slide, please. And CEOs at 64% are expected to lead, particularly strong when it comes to issues that condemn human rights, as we've said in some slides before, but also threatening our own the national security of the respondents that we're talking to in their own specific countries. Next slide. Of all of the areas that we have, looked at, and this is a data that we've been pulling for a while, so we have year over year. We're starting to see the adding in this new layer on companies, should they continue doing business in Ukraine or not, that the majority of CEOs are expected to inform political issues as it relates to the running of their business and the views of their employees. Next slide, please. And the strongest support is for the CEOs. For the CEO as a spokesperson. So they want to hear from the CEO, and they want the CEO to be on the front line for social and geopolitical issues. And what we guide, and you can see the different spokespeople categories here. Local CEOs also important. CCOs probably sort of coming in toward the end, but of course they're informing the overarching communication strategy, regardless if they are the spokesperson. And what we've been telling clients for a long time is certain social issues are going to, there's absolutely going to be an expectation that you're speaking out and you're giving guidance at the very least to employees. I know I'm here in Washington today, and there's a lot of anticipation about the Supreme Court hearing in Roe versus Wade. And we're talking a lot to clients about how they are supporting employees as they during this time. But I think that now you're starting to see geopolitics, pick up as another strong expectation. So in closing for this section, we are believing that geopolitics is here to stay. And so sort of getting comfortable with when and how you want to comment as a company is important. And our counsel is always to lead with your values, make sure your values are incredibly well understood so that when you do come out in support of your company's values on any of these issues, it's pretty self-evident and pretty much expected. Same goes for social issues, staying at the fore, that economic growth and financial stability are still the core remit as it relates to building trust and bringing greater unity to society, and that CEOs must lead from the front. And so really creating consensus around boards and employees and customers on sort of where their brand needs to be as it relates to some of these global issues that are happening around the world. So with that, I will look forward to your questions and hand it over to Oscar.
Unmute. Thank you, Deirdre, and hello, everyone. And as Deirdre mentioned on the onset, seems like trust is ever more, is even more a topic of importance, so central to the work that we do as communications professionals. And foundational, I think, to honestly reputation management. I mean, you can't have a good reputation without an underlying foundation of trust. That's the basic philosophy we have at Edelman, which is why we're so devoted to studying the topic of trust in all the many ways that we do year in, year out now for 22 years running. We're also living in interesting times where, whether it's geopolitical issues or racial justice issues or others, societal issues are constantly converging with business issues every day, constantly. And I think it's requiring us to have not only communications acumen and business acumen, but also societal acumen. We as communications professionals increasingly need to be cognizant of what is going on in the world around us, because it's affecting every stakeholder group our clients or has relationships with: investors, employees, customers, you name it. So, so this wave, which is the second annual wave on the topic of racial justice, is critically important these days for the many reasons I think we know just from reading the news. So let's dive right in. Next slide. So we surveyed, this is a US sampling of about 2,000 people in the general population. Approximately a little over 1,200 were white, 500 Black, 500 Hispanic, 500 Asian. And basically 49% male, 51% female, and also a good mix of Democrat, Republican, and independent or other party views. Next slide. And one of the key initial takeaways is, is that while racial justice issues are of growing importance to many quarters of our US society, it's the perception is that employers are often failing to heed the growing call for racial justice. Next slide. In fact, our data suggests that this perception of failure to heed the call in a really effective way is contributing to a general, constant, and elevated state of anxiety about racial justice for many individuals. After peaking in the immediate wake of George Floyd's murder last May a year ago, which shortly thereafter we did our first wave on the racial justice topic, the concern level in our survey month to month has consistently stayed around that 60% or higher range. Next slide. And the racism fears, this sense of anxiety is not limited to any one particular community. It's across all the racial and ethnic segments we track. So, you see here an uptick in the white community. Likewise, in the Black community, where it's, I think, highest at 84% as of May, Hispanic, 74%, and Asian, obviously, unfortunately, with all the reports of violence against Asian Americans around the country, it elevated too from April to May of just this year alone. So, this is a topic that's just not isolated to one pocket of our society. It's a broad concern to people across all the groups we track. Next slide. So there's also, recognition of racial injustice. The recognition of the existence of the problem also holds true across all the groups that we track. And for the general population, it is a rather high score here. When asked, I believe systemic racism and racial injustice exists in this country, 73% of respondents agreed with that statement. I'd call it, and this was especially true, I think, for younger segments of the population, 83% from 18 to 34-year-olds, just a 6-point jump from a year ago. 90% for Black Americans overall. So, again, and if you remember the scoring on trust, anything below 50 is a distrust sentiment. Anything 50 to 59 is kind of neutral, and anything above, 60 or higher is trust. These are pretty tough scores when you're asking, if you believe in that statement or not. Next slide. Also interesting is the level of engagement on this topic. So it's translated into advocacy and activism that I think is pretty impressive. So it's not just, hey, I sense there's a problem, I'm concerned about it. Many of the people we surveyed in this wave of the survey say they're engaged in some way on the topic, particularly young people at 70% are either advocates or they describe themselves as advocates. 56% for 35 to 54-year-olds. So the level of engagement on this topic, and I'm sure many of you who do in-house work for major employers and are hearing directly from your employees can probably relate to this particular slide. Next slide, please. Now, as the Trust Barometer has done all these years, we like to track trust on those for different institutional pillars of our society. We did the same here with this wave on racial justice. So turns out if we trust anyone at all on this topic, it's likely to be our own employer at 72%. Anyone else? Not so much. Not even NGOs, not businesses, and certainly not the media or the government, which are actually outright distrusted on these topics. Next slide. So now we'll take a look at this topic from a purely workplace lens, how people feel about it in the workplace. Next slide. And so while people will say, and there's a little bit of dissonance here, that they trust my employer on the topic, it doesn't necessarily translate into employers living up to their expectations in terms of how they're delivering on their promises on racial justice. So, but it's pretty clear that many people would consider a company's record on this topic to be a filter through which whether they would remain at an employer or choose one. So when asked if they related to this statement, I would not work for an organization that fails to speak out against racial injustice, or I have left a job in the last year because the organization has failed to address racism. Fully 6 out of 10 of us agree with that statement. And I think we probably have all known somebody in our lives who have maybe evaluated an employer on that basis. And again, I would call out the 18 to 34-year-olds in this survey, the future generation of workplaces, and many who are and probably the fastest growing part of our workplace today. They feel strongly and relate strongly to a statement like this at 72%. Okay, next slide. So, okay, so people who agree with the following statement: how much meaningful progress has your employer made addressing racism and racial inequities in the workplace? Generally are going to score higher on loyalty, employee advocacy, and also commitment. So I want to stay working for my employer for many years. Is, you know, if they feel their employer is doing a lot on this front, they're going to score very highly in terms of their commitment of loyalty to the employer. But if their belief is that their employer is not doing little, if nothing at all on this front, you can expect loyalty levels to be very low. Likewise, in terms of them seeing themselves as being advocates for their employers, if they perceive their employees are making a lot of great progress in delivering on their promises on racial justice, the people are inclined to advocate on behalf of their employer rather strongly at 88%, saying they would do that if they believe their employers are doing a lot of work on this front. And their commitment to the employer, again, doing more than what's expected of them in the workplace. So their engagement as employees would also be very, very high. It goes in the other direction. Again, if they sense that an employer's commitment to the topic of racial justice just doesn't ring true in the deeds that go with their words. Next slide. Okay. This will get into some more insights that further underscore this perception that employers generally are not living up to their promises. Next slide. So sadly, less than 1 in 4 employees report that a workplace is free of racism. And I think what's interesting about this is that, again, this is a belief. This roughly less than 1 out of 4 stance is true for whites, for Blacks, for Hispanics, and Asian Americans, including with statements like, my work environment is free of microaggressions, or we are free of racist traditions and people. Next slide. Less than 1 in 4 employees report a representative workplace, that they're working in a workplace that does a good job of employing people that look like themselves. And again, this is holding true for all the racial and ethnic groups we track. And it's rather consistent, the view, and even lower as you get into specific pockets of the workplace, like mid-level managers, or on certain questions like whether or not they believe their employer has a diverse supply base, or that their executive leadership is doing its part to drive racial representation in the workplace. Those scores are fairly low, so it's far less than 1 in 4. And then whether or not board of directors are racially representative. Next slide. Only 1 in 4 can count on their employer for equity and inclusion, right? And for particular areas like pay equity or career development or community initiatives that serve the needs of all racial and ethnic communities, or employee assistance programs. I thought this was pretty sad that barely 20% believe they can count on their employers for employee assistance programs, when that's a kind of a staple employee offering. And yet at a time of a lot of discussion around mental health and well-being, that confidence levels are so low in terms of the way employees perceive how much they can rely on their employer for that kind of support. So again, some tough numbers here. Next slide. We also explored the topic of leadership and how much leadership is being delivered on the part of employers and how our survey respondents perceive that. And the perception is there's a lack of leadership, and this lack of leadership is getting in the way of progress. So I do not see my company making much progress addressing racism and racial equity in the workplace. Just over half of our survey respondents felt that statement was true. And again, whites came in lowest at 46%, but nearly half of them agree with the statement as well. It was highest for Black and Asian Americans, Hispanics, 50-50, right on the nose. And there were 5 reasons survey respondents cited for why there's this lack of progress. 1, no one is tasked with leading DE&I initiatives. 2, too many employees worry DE&I initiatives would exclude them. 3, executives do not prioritize eliminating racial inequities. 4, executives do not see racism as a problem. And 5, no one has called for DE&I. Next slide. Some of the leaders, specific leaders themselves in DE&I efforts in the workplace lack credibility as well. And as it turns out, no single voice is trusted. And on this slide, I need to go to the bottom as opposed to start at the top, because I think that's the most fascinating insight. The head of DE&I is often the least trusted. We saw a 3-point decline from the survey, from our survey wave a year ago on this topic. I think that just speaks to how difficult the role that is very often, to what degree the individuals in those roles are perceived as being empowered to be able to make true progress on this front. It's also notable that the CEO doesn't rank fairly that high either at 24%, nor the head of HR. So there's some key leaders in the workplace who typically would be seen at being at the forefront of any DE&I effort, but nonetheless, generally speaking, are not viewed in the most credible light. Next slide. Only 4 in 10 agree DE&I initiatives benefit all employees. So this is generally, I mean, the feeling across, again, all the groups we track: white, Black, Hispanic, Asian. By a few points here or there, 2 to 3, they generally all feel the same, although I'll note that at 48%, Asian employees were highest in terms of their sentiments here. But so while the movement on DE&I is all about inclusion and equity, there's perceptions of inequity and lack of inclusion and lack of representation that still permeate in the minds of many employees. Next slide. So the call for action for leadership. Next slide. Companies must keep the promises they've made. So we asked respondents, I believe companies are not living up to the promises they have made to address racism within their organization and the country. So, and we had drilled down into statements like companies are doing a mediocre job, companies are failing, doing poorly. And again, with the younger cohort, in this survey wave, 62% agree with these statements and would not give employers high marks. In fact, the poorly number I think is highest for with the 18 and 34-year-olds. Likewise, white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, all at least at 50 or higher, with Asian Americans at the highest level, just one tick above the Black segment. Next slide. I also think there's a high expectation that we're going to get better at this, and we're going to back to my comments about societal acumen, that we're going to get more knowledgeable about this topic and more engaged. So this slide speaks to the percentage who agree with the statement. I expect CEOs to do something in response to systemic racism and racial justice. 82%, very high for the whole 2,000 of the respondents we surveyed, and pretty high for all the segments within it. And there were 5 actions in particular they expected CEOs to take. 1, to institute a policy of zero tolerance of racism. 2, to educate themselves on issues that impact communities. 3, ensure that workforce at all levels is representative of the country as a whole. 5, ensure there is diversity on a company's board. And 6, foster the career growth of Black, Hispanic, and Asian employees. So, in the eyes of many people we surveyed, these are the table stake things, the engagement and action they're expecting from key leaders in the DE&I effort. Next slide. Equity is among one of the biggest issues that CEOs and others are expected to address here in an age where it's generally recognized we have significant income inequality in our nation. I think it's not surprising that the topic of wage inequality ranks so high here at 67%, with strong or some expectation that companies are going to do something about this topic. And again, Asians top here at 75. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. The Black group, the Black segment at 76, then Asians, Hispanic Americans, and then whites. Technology and automation, I think that's interesting as well too, because even before the pandemic, I thought there was a lot of conversation in our country about the looming threat that AI and other advanced technologies would have on future jobs. Well, those fears are still there, even behind all of our concerns about the pandemic at 63%. Prejudice and discrimination, logically, that's ranking high. And then climate change is a big concern. So even as strong as the feelings have been and expressed in this survey, there are some other really core issues weighing on the minds of average Americans that rank highly and may even transcend the issue of racial justice, but obviously has overlap with them too. Next slide. This is something you've heard a lot from prior Trust Barometer surveys that we've conducted. I think increasingly more and more folks are expecting CEOs to use their platform for change and positive change in the world, and to use their voice in that effort. On the racial justice topic, that sentiment is no different. And in fact, survey respondents would say, don't wait for progress before you weigh in and lead on this effort. Don't underestimate the power of your voice on this topic. You need to act now, even before you have a lot of accomplished goals to be able to speak about. And this is especially true in the Black, Hispanic, and Asian segments of our survey. You can see they were all there, 32 or 31% felt strongly this way. And really each group, 50% or more, believed that this was true. So this is an interesting thing to consider, as people also, I think all of us who do this line of work have all dealt with executives who may have some trepidation about going public in a very prominent way about any sort of hot issue in our society today. Next slide. So four key takeaways that we can glean from this survey, from this part of the survey wave, is just that, action earns trust. Slide after slide here, you saw that while I think people would love to trust their employer and believe that they can count on them on this topic, their actions are ultimately going to be what earns their strong trust. Two, as DE&I is pursued in organizations, the leaders who are leading those efforts need to be empowered to be effective at them. And everybody's watching. And as you can see, they would say, like, well, it's great that you're saying the right things, but you may not be doing enough of the right things. And as a result, there's a credibility challenge these leaders have. And then CEOs, it's never too soon for them to show a personal commitment on this topic. Speak up. Don't wait to get your whole DE&I house in order perfectly. We need you to stand by us now. And then finally, I think there are actual specific actions companies can be implementing that add up to the kind of structural and cultural change that leads to progress in this front. With a perfect example of just simply zero tolerance of discrimination in the workplace. An act just like that alone, I think, is going to make a difference in terms of perceptions of how well companies are doing on this topic. So thank you. With that, I'm eager to hear questions from the audience, and I'll hand it back to Deidre and Brittany.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We do have a ton of questions and conversation in the chat, and then also in our Q&A. We will start with the Q&A. And so then both of you, if you want to jump in, depending on how you see fit, when I read out certain questions, we'll sort of take it away in that manner. So we have a question about, have you seen much activity from businesses with regard to taking stands on abortion?
So we are tracking that very closely as an agency. We know it's a topic of that's top of mind, not only for just society at large and many Americans and certainly the media, but also for companies, and they're looking for guidance on that front, to be sure. I don't think you're seeing quite as much of the vocal statements like we saw with the Ukraine response that I think businesses rallied around. However, I do think, I was just looking at the list of companies, many companies have adjusted their benefits to allow for travel costs and other things that would help shoulder some of the burden of employees who are in need of getting abortion care, are able to get it in a state in which it will still be permissible in the future should Roe versus Wade be changed. So there is movement on this topic. I just think that there is some tentativeness because it is so politically polarized as it's been presented and as it's being covered at large by the press. I don't know if Deidre has anything to add on that.
Well, and I realize that, there different belief systems bring, different perspectives to the table, but I would say that the number one audience, regardless of that, the number one audience is employees. So whether it's pointing to benefits that already exist, that they hadn't thought of using them in this way, or whether it's providing, new types of benefits that support the concerns and needs of the employee, kind of back to Oscar's point on employee assistance, this sort of fits there. That I will share, we did but also convening that employee group and making sure that they know that they have a place to express their concerns, their interests, their issues. I know at Edelman, a call was held in the United States just to hear people's perspective, and it was attended by over 500 people. And really emotional stories being shared, which really kind of surprised me that was such an intense gathering, but it was. And so just to keep that in the forefront of how does it impact employees and how can the employer help?
Honestly, that sometimes a safe space to have a conversation internally in a safe environment, maybe more meaningful to an employee than getting the right press statement just right, you know? So
Well, that's trust builds action, or action builds trust right there, right? And pretty simply achieved.
that's right.
Okay, and then Deidre, we have a question. How deep is the increased expectation of business towards Ukraine now versus past years, like with Iran? Example, 20% higher.
So the focus of Ukraine has only was only in the survey that was fielded in April, and we didn't, to my knowledge, we didn't look at Iran specifically back when some of those issues were cropping up. So this is new data, but I don't think it's surprising data given you know, the world's response to the crisis in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about what is the thought about business leaders' roles in addressing societal violence?
I'm sorry, say that one more time, Brittany.
What is the thought about businesses leaders' roles in addressing societal violence?
Societal violence. You know, if there's one principle here that I think underlies all of the insights we've just covered, is paying attention to how an institution's actions line up with their words, right? Because it's not just enough to respond to the call to speak up, although that has value in and of itself, as we saw in the racial justice wave, but you're also great on what you're doing to back up your language. So that's, I think, really key. So whether it's violence, as in the case of this question, or some of the other racial justice topics and concerns covered in the wave we just reviewed, or the Ukraine topic and geopolitical issues, you know, there's what is being said and what is actually happening. And if there's a lot of daylight between those two, I don't think we can expect levels of trust to be high.
Yeah, I would say it's also, there's a high dose of bravery involved in some of that. I recall years ago, Michael Corbett, who was the CEO of Citi, came out very early on the gun issue and you know, took some heat. Like most of our CEOs, they'll say, I've got 50% of my customers on this side of the issue and 50% on this side of the issue. But something like public safety seems like you should be able to find some safe space about public safety and social violence.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question. Are these the panel data? Sorry, let me actually go there. Have you been able to ascertain in all of these categories what role media plays in perception?
Yeah, well, I think so. For 22 years, the Edelman Trust Barometer has looked at levels of trust for business, government, NGOs, and media. And the first wave that kicked off the year out of the Edelman Trust Barometer was all about the cycle of mistrust or distrust. It seems to be the de facto emotion that we all have because trust levels were so low in each of those four institutions. And because we don't trust any one of them, it's like it's this circular, you know, vicious cycle of distrust that is, frankly, somewhat. It is a threat to our society because if you can't believe in any of your institutions, what can you believe? So, so I think media absolutely is playing a role here, and their own standing in society is affecting how we're taking in information and content on all these topics.
Yeah, a few years ago, we started we look at a whole bunch of sectors, trust in a whole bunch of sectors, and I look after the financial services sector, so I always would present the data and say that we were the least trusted sector until we started measuring social media as a sector. So it is the least trusted sector because of the polarization and the worried about, you know, concerns about, you know, dark threats and so forth. But I will say a couple of years ago, we saw while trust in media was very low, trust in journalism, or journalists, I should say, like the human, was somewhat higher. We've seen trust in broadcast news, like practically flatline, like no trust at all. Again, so polarized there. But I think we all really applaud the organizations like the New York Times and Axios, are just a couple that I'm aware of, that really goes into providing a great deal of edification to readers on how editorial decisions are made, and the research that goes into the news that they're providing in hopes of turning the tide on disinformation.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question. So as the war drags on and that we're seeing the impact on inflation, gas, and food, do we imagine that people's initial advocacy for boycotting will soften and evaporate? Will people continue to be so outspoken when it's hitting them in the wallet?
So will the current state of the economy be a disincentive for advocacy and action? I don't think so. I actually think it might in some ways be a catalyst for it, because it is an interesting, the economy is a mixed bag, but it also has some pretty striking things in it right now that we haven't seen in several decades. Gas prices, certainly in real terms at this level, are very, very high. And for anybody who has a commute to the workplace, that's a real cost of living. And then energy being what it is, it affects the costs of so many other things in our daily lives that we rely on. But yet there's a lot of hiring going on, and there's a war for talent, and people believe they've got all kinds of employment choices out there, and there is economic growth. Although you're seeing now the stock market starting to reflect the reality of what an active Fed program to tame inflation with rising rates might result in, right? So, which could be a slower economy in the offing. But I think irrespective of good times and bad, some of these issues that have been in the survey, income inequality as an example, have been around now, and we've been talking about for darn near close to a decade. And then we also have what appears to be a rather activist Supreme Court, and whether inflation is high or low, if core civil rights are viewed as being threatened, I think you'll see people react to that. So no, there might be some economic sensitivity there, but I don't think enough so that it's going to quelch, people's desires to make a difference in the world.
Yeah, I also believe it's going to deepen the bonds even further between employer and employee. And I think as it relates to things like, am I going to be asked to commute when gas is $5 a gallon? Or is my employer looking out for my psychological safety? What's the anxiety around all of these conversations? And I think it could start to show a tapering off of the Great Resignation as people really sort of see the bond that they have with their employer and want to really be more tightly connected to that community that is there and that has my back.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have for Q&A today. I want to thank you both so much for hosting this webinar. I know that we have had a ton of conversation and within the chat, and I'm sure that this, with all the research on trust that Edelman does continuously, there'll be just more and more findings to stay tuned for.
Can I put in a shameless plug? So it's our honor to share this research. We share it with boardrooms and summer intern offsites and everything in between. So if anything piques your interest and you'd like someone to kind of walk through any of this data, it's always something we're up for. And
then I'll also just put in a plug for IPR. I've been a trustee for about a decade for the Institute of Public Relations, hard to believe, and I think the fact that we have the opportunity to have conversations like this and share this kind of information is another reason why the Institute for Public Relations is such a special place. So thank you for having us.
Well, thank you both so much again. Thank you for everyone who attended today. This webinar recording will be available on our website and on YouTube, and we'll be sure to share all these resources with you all. But that is all from us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.